Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving deep today into one of the most fundamental knots in all of philosophy.
It really is. It's one of those questions that seems so simple on the surface.
Exactly, the problem of perception. For the everyday person, it's, simple. I look at this coffee mug, I see a coffee mug, end of story.
Right. What's there to debate?
But the moment philosophers start asking, can we ever directly perceive the physical world? Everything just dissolves into centuries of skepticism.
It does, and that deceptively simple question has been the engine of so much of Western philosophy, really forcing thinkers into corners they'd, well, rather avoid.
And I think today's deep dive is really for any listener who's ever wondered, how do we bridge that gap? That gap between our own internal subjective experience, our consciousness, and the external mind-independent world.
That's the perfect framing.
And just to be super clear, we're not talking about the mechanics of vision, right? Or
Yeah.
neurobiology.
No, not at all. This is a purely philosophical challenge. The issue isn't one that physiology or psychology can solve on its own. Because we're focused on the logical consistency of our claims about awareness itself, the central philosophical problem is often called the veil of perception.
The veil of perception.
Yeah, the idea is that certain arguments, specifically those based on perceptual errors, and we're going to talk a lot about illusions and hallucinations, have long suggested that direct awareness of the physical world is, well, logically impossible.
Okay, so give me an example. Because if I see a straight stick that looks bent in water,
The classic example.
right, or if I hallucinate a pink elephant, the bentness and the pinkness, they're clearly not features of the external physical object. The stick isn't bent. The elephant isn't there.
Exactly.
So what is it that's carrying those qualities? Where do they live?
And that's the core difficulty. That's the question that trips everyone up. Philosophers trying to account for this error, they often conclude that what we are actually aware of in every single case of perception,
Whether it's correct or not.
whether it's correct or incorrect, veridical or illusory, must be some sort of internal subjective proxy, a representation.
And that proxy, that internal stand-in, that's what creates the veil.
That's the veil.
We stop seeing the objective world and we start, what? Seeing our own mental representations of it. We're trapped behind our own eyes, basically.
Yes. And if you accept those skeptical arguments, you are historically forced toward one of two major alternatives. The first is idealism.
Okay, idealism.
The belief, championed by figures like George Berkeley, that the physical world is ultimately dependent on consciousness. The problem disappears because, well, reality is mental to begin with.
Or the second option, which is maybe a little more common sense.
A little. Indirect realism. This view accepts that the physical world is real, but it asserts that we only perceive it via those mental stand-ins, those proxies, or what are most famously termed sense data.
And the author of the text we're digging into today claims to have, what, cut that Gordian knot?
That is the claim. They propose a systematic defense of direct realism, the common sense view that we see the world as it is, by successfully dismantling its two major intellectual attackers.
The argument from illusion and the argument from hallucination.
Those are the two. It's an enormous undertaking.
It really is a massive claim, solving the problem of perception. So let's not mince words or, bury the headline here. What is the executive thesis? What is the single coherent philosophical claim this entire work pivots on?
Okay, so the central claim is this, in a nutshell. Direct realism, the view that we can be directly aware of physical objects, can be successfully defended against the argument from illusion and the argument from hallucination.
Okay.
By analyzing sensory qualities as inherent features of experience rather than objects of awareness, and by establishing three non-conceptual intentional sources of perception.
Whoa. Okay. That is dense.
It is very dense.
For the listener who might be feeling a little overwhelmed by the terminology there, let's stop right there and break that down, because that feels like the map for our entire deep dive.
Absolutely. Think of the thesis as proposing a solution in three parts. First, it identifies the source of all the trouble, these things called sensory qualities.
The yellowness of the wall, the bentness of the stick.
Exactly. Second, it shifts the location of those qualities. This is the big move. It moves them from being external objects of our awareness like sense data to being intrinsic features of the conscious experience itself.
So the yellowness is in my seeing, not in a thing I see.
You've got it. And third, having gotten rid of sense data, the thesis then has to provide a positive story. It identifies these non-conceptual structures, the three sources he mentions, that genuinely connect our minds directly to the independent physical world.
Perfect. That clarity helps immensely. Now, Let's place this argument in its historical context. What is the historical problem the text is primarily responding to?
The text is fundamentally responding to that big question. Is direct awareness of the physical world logically possible?
And this is a question that really took off in the 17th and 18th centuries.
Yes, with thinkers like Locke and Hume. That's when the skepticism really got its footing.
And those skeptical arguments, they came about because earlier philosophers were trying to build this complete systematic knowledge of the world. But they just couldn't account for simple perceptual error without inventing some kind of subjective entity.
That's the heart of it. When they tried to fit the raw physical world into a neat logical frame, they couldn't explain how a white wall could look yellow or how a straight stick could look bent without having some kind of subjective entity, a proxy, that bore the contradictory or erroneous quality.
Because the object itself can't be both white and yellow at the same time.
Right, that's a contradiction. So the yellowness must belong to something else. And that seemingly simple logical constraint led directly to the use of these proxies and ultimately created the veil.
The author's argument is essentially saying we just don't need the proxy. We just have to look at the nature of experience differently.
Precisely.
So let's clarify the fundamental position being defended here. Realism. What does that mean in this context?
Realism, as it's used here, just means that the physical world, specifically its purely material stratum, exists independent of consciousness.
The common sense view. If all conscious beings vanished tomorrow, the planets, the stars, the laws of physics, they'd all still be here.
Yes. Its existence is brute. It's not dependent on what we might think or perceive.
But the sources also make a really interesting distinction here, noting that this definition of realism, it gets more complex when you bring in things like meaning or language or social constructs.
It does, and this is where continental philosophy offers a fascinating contrast. You have thinkers in that tradition who argue that certain concepts we take for granted as real, like destruction or distance, or even the unified concept of a world, they can't exist independent of consciousness.
Can you give me an example of that?
Well, take the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. He claimed that the concept of destruction inherently involves an element of negativity, a nothingness, which must necessarily be introduced by conscious beings.
What does that mean?
It means you need a conscious subject to observe a building and see its destruction, rather than just observing a rearrangement of material.
Ah, I see. Because without consciousness, the building doesn't fail to exist. Its constituent parts, bricks, dust, metal, they just change their configuration.
Exactly. Or consider Georges Bataille, who once famously argued with A.J. Ayer about whether dinosaurs existed before humans.
That sounds like a fun argument.
Well, Bataille wasn't denying that large reptiles once roamed the Earth. He was arguing that nothing could be termed a dinosaur, categorized, or taxonomized without human conceptual and linguistic interests.
So the brute matter was there, but the concept dinosaur wasn't.
Right. And this highlights the crucial distinction. We have to assume the existence of a purely physical stratum to even begin this conversation. But direct realism is the specific and much more difficult claim that we can be directly aware of objects possessing that stratum even before we apply our concepts to them.
And if that direct realism fails, we are forced back into one of the two uncomfortable positions we mentioned earlier.
Right. If the physical world is real but we can't perceive it directly, we are indirect realists, stuck behind the sense data.
And if we're forced to admit that the perception is direct, but the objects themselves are actually mental,
then we become idealists. The whole purpose of this rigorous work is to provide a more straightforward solution by showing how direct realism can be consistently defended without these mediating entities.
Okay, so to dismantle this veil, we first have to really understand the structure that built it. And that structure is the argument from illusion.
Yes, and it's a powerful argument because it uses what's called subjective identity, the fact that a real perception and a mistaken one can feel exactly the same, to force the conclusion of indirect realism.
Let's look at the logical reconstruction of that in standard form. I think this helps isolate the exact premise the author is going to target for rejection.
It does. The argument is usually summarized like this. Sometimes it's called the argument from perceptual relativity or illusion. So P1.
Premise 1.
In cases of genuine perception, whether it's veridical or illusory, sensory qualities are present to consciousness.
Let's ground that immediately. If I look at a white wall under strange yellowy light and it looks yellow to me, the sensory quality of yellowness is undeniably present to my consciousness.
Yes, that's just a description of your experience.
It's a fact about my mental life.
Yeah.
Okay, P2.
P2. When a subject is hallucinating, they are aware of something, a sensory quality or what's called a quale, that does not exist objectively in the physical world.
Right, the pinkness of the hallucinated elephant is present to me, but it's objectively non-existent.
Yeah.
The feeling is real, but the object of the feeling is not.
Precisely. Now, P3. This is the crucial one.
Okay.
If the sensory experience of a genuine perception, let's say seeing a truly yellow object, is subjectively identical to that of a hallucination, say seeing a non-existent yellow object, they must share a common nature and a common object of awareness.
The highest common factor assumption.
That's the one.
Ah, this is where the trap snaps shut.
It is.
Because the experience feels identical, the opponent insists the internal mechanism must also be identical.
Yes.
And if the mechanism is identical, in one case the hallucination definitely involves a non-physical proxy or sense-datum.
Then both cases must involve a non-physical proxy.
Which leads to the conclusion, C.
C. Therefore, in all cases of perception, the subject is ultimately aware of a non-normal, non-physical object, a sense-datum or perceptual proxy leading to indirect realism or idealism.
And as you said, the entire defense of direct realism in this text hinges on rejecting P3.
That's the target. Denying that subjectively identical experiences must share an identical separate object, the sense-datum.
To do that, we absolutely need to ensure we have the conceptual tools to break that premise. So before we go any further, let's nail down the key terms, and specifically the distinction that powers the author's countermove.
Absolutely. The precision of the vocabulary is it's paramount here.
Okay, term number 1, direct realism.
That's the claim that we can be directly aware of objects that possess a purely material stratum, meaning the physical world, without any mediating mental stand-ins.
The view we're trying to save. Now, indirect realism.
That's the view that, yes, the physical world is real, but our awareness of it is mediated through perceiving something else, a perceptual proxy or sense-datum.
And that leads to the third term, the thing the author wants to get rid of, the sense-datum.
Right. The sense-datum is this non-normal, non-physical object or proxy that goes proxy for a physical object. It's traditionally considered the immediate private object of our awareness.
Okay, now for the really critical distinction, the one between qualities.
This is key. Fourth, sensible quality.
Uh.
This refers to a perceptible feature of a physical object.
Like its genuine redness or its sphericity or its texture, the quality that the object truly possesses when I'm seeing it correctly.
Yes, that's the objective quality. Now, fifth, sensory quality.
And this is different.
This is the intrinsic feature of sense experience itself. This is the yellowness that appears when a white wall looks yellow, or the feeling of bentness when the stick is in water.
Ah, so it's not a quality of a separate object, like a sense-datum.
No. The claim is that it inheres in the conscious experience, in the very act of seeing.
I think I follow the logic, but let's pause on the real-world consequence of that. If the yellowness is an intrinsic feature of the experience, that shifts the grammar of how we talk about this entirely.
It does.
We move from describing an object, like a yellow sense-datum, to describing the act of perceiving. So I'm still aware of the wall, but I'm aware of it. How does that work?
You are aware of it yellowly.
Yellowly.
Yes, and this is why this counter move is often called the adverbial view. The quality, yellow, acts as an adverb modifying the verb seeing. You are not seeing a yellow thing, you're seeing yellowly.
I see.
This is the pivotal maneuver. You shift the quality from being an object of awareness, a sense-datum, to being an intrinsic modification of the experience itself.
And that completely undercuts P3.
It does, because the identical feeling no longer implies an identical separate object.
That makes the shift much more digestible.
Right.
Okay, final piece of vocabulary we need. The one that deals with the sheer existence problem of hallucination.
That would be intentionalism. This is the denial of the common assumption that the expression is aware of must always express a relation between two existing entities.
So it's a philosophical stance that allows us to handle the non-existent objects of hallucination.
Right. We can be aware of non-entities, and the awareness itself remains a real psychological state without forcing us to invent some weird metaphysical object for the non-entity to reside in.
Okay, so now we use those tools to address the argument from illusion head-on. The core difficulty is, well, phenomenological. How does direct realism account for the rich, sensory character of an illusion without inventing sense data to bear those qualities?
Well, the crux of the argument, the thing the author is directly responding to, is that demanding a physical object possess the sensible quality of every single experience forces the failure of direct realism.
It's a trap.
It's a trap. The source material states it clearly. It says, What the argument from illusion attempts primarily to achieve is the recognition that sensible qualities can be present to consciousness and perception, despite the fact that they do not characterize the normal physical objects we are said to be perceiving. It then challenges us to make sense of this fact.
That's the classic pressure point. The straight stick in water looks bent. The stick is straight. How does bentness get into the picture if all I'm aware of is the stick?
The opponent demands a place for that bentness. They say, since the experience of the apparent bentness is subjectively identical to seeing a truly bent stick, and the actual stick is straight, it must be contained in a subjective thing we are aware of, the sense-datum.
And the problem, according to the author, lies in this deeply ingrained assumption of the act-object analysis of consciousness.
Exactly.
Could you explain that act-object error more fully? What does that mean?
For centuries, consciousness was conceived of as a purely diaphanous, characterless act, like a transparent window.
Just a clear pane of glass.
A clear pane of glass directed at a separate, luminous object. So, if the conscious act itself is colorless and featureless, then all the characteristics, the yellowness, the bentness, the texture, all of it must reside in the object being perceived.
Okay, I see the logic.
So if the true object, the straight stick, doesn't have the characteristic of bentness, then we must conclude we're looking at a different object, the sense-datum, which does have that characteristic. The act-object analysis, it just inevitably leads you to proxies.
So the countermove is to reject the idea that consciousness is diaphanous. My act of seeing is not a clear, colorless window. It is itself intrinsically modified by what I'm seeing.
That is precisely the move. The stick and water analogy is crucial here. The indirect realist insists you are immediately aware of a bent sense-datum. The author argues that the bentness is not an object you are aware of, but an intrinsic modification of your visual experience, a sensory quality inhering in the act of vision itself.
You are aware of the stick, but you are aware of it bently. It's like a sophisticated camera filter, but the filter is built into my visual apparatus. It's not applied as a separate image. When I see the white wall look yellow, the yellow sensation is an intrinsic characteristic of the way the conscious act of seeing the wall is happening.
And crucially,
The experience is still directed at the wall.
it is still directed at the wall. This is the elegance of the adverbial view. In veridical perception, the sensory quality, the intrinsic modification, it corresponds to a sensible quality, a real property of the external object.
An illusion.
In illusion, the sensory quality exists, but it does not correspond to a real property of the object. But in both cases, the awareness is directed toward the real physical external object. The subject is aware of the white wall, even though the perception is modified yellowly.
This countermove has a profound consequence, though. It's one that often makes philosophers squirm.
It does.
It forces the acceptance of the traditional primary-secondary quality distinction.
It absolutely does, and the source material stresses that this distinction is forced upon us by the defense of direct realism itself. We have placed the sensuous qualities, color, taste, warmth firmly inside the realm of subjective experience.
We've defined them as psychological items that inhere in consciousness.
Yes.
Wait a minute. If we internalize all sensory qualities, making them intrinsic to the experience, doesn't that make the brute physical world completely alien to us? Are we just trading the veil of perception for a kind of, veil of the physical where the world is just colorless, silent, textureless matter?
That is the steep price, but it's a price the author argues is necessary to save the coherence of direct realism.
Why is it necessary?
Because if a physical object in its purely material stratum did possess the sensory quality of yellowness, then in the illusion case, it would have to be both yellow and white at the same time.
Which is a contradiction.
It's a contradiction. So to avoid the contradiction and maintain that we see the real object, we must define the real object as being devoid of the sensuous character that is subjectively present.
The physical object is colorless, silent, and unwarm.
Yes. Its redness is conceived of not as an intrinsic quality, but as a disposition, a power, or a tendency to cause sensory redness in observers under standard conditions.
So by removing the sensuous character from the brute physical object, we save direct realism from the argument, from illusion.
The problem is solved by relocating the quality from an object, the sense-datum, to an act, the experience.
Okay, so now that we've used this adverbial view to explain what perception isn't, it's not a relationship to a sense-datum, we have to turn to the positive question. What is perception? What structures within our experience provide that world-directedness, that intentionality, that connects us directly to the physical world if it's not our concepts?
Right, we've cleared the ground, now we have to build something on it. And this means we have to reject the idea that perception is essentially an act of high-level thought or conceptual judgment.
And the author does this by critiquing something called the dual component theory.
Yes, an earlier attempt to save direct realism by splitting the perceptual act into two parts.
The theory associated with figures like Thomas Reid and Wilfrid Sellars, how do they try to save direct realism?
Well, they proposed that perception was split into two components: an objectless sensation.
Like a raw, non-cognitive input,
Mm.
a patch of color.
Exactly. Plus a subsequent conceptual judgment that takes that sensation as being caused by an object.
So I judge that this raw color patch is caused by a red object.
Right. But the author critiques this because the cognitive judgment, it comes too late to account for the immediate sense of acquaintance we have with the physical world.
What does too late mean?
It means it's fundamentally unsatisfactory because it renders perception merely epistemically indirect. If the raw sensation is just an awareness of an internal state, this objectless input and acquaintance with the external world only happens when I judge that the sensation refers to an object. I am not experiencing genuine immediate contact.
I'm still just inferring the object from an internal state.
You're still inferring. And we need to do justice to the immediate sensory presence of physical objects to us, which is what direct realism claims in the first place.
So that failure leads us directly to the critique of what's called high conceptualism, the idea that every perceptual experience is inherently shot through with concepts.
This is a view popularized by thinkers like John McDowell, and it insists that you cannot perceive something without applying a concept to it. When you look out the window, you don't just see a collection of shapes and colors.
You see a car, a tree, a person.
Exactly. This links perception intimately with our linguistic and cognitive abilities.
This sounds intuitively true for adult language-using humans, but the critique uses two immensely powerful counterexamples to prove that perception exists prior to and independently of conceptualization.
The first is the counterexample of associative agnosia.
Agnosia.
Yes, patients suffering from this condition provide striking, almost clinical proof. They have no difficulty with the mechanics of sight. They can identify colors, track movement, and even successfully copy or draw an object.
So they can see the input just fine. Their eyes are working.
Their eyes are working perfectly. They have normal visual acuity, but they completely fail to classify or recognize the object.
Wow.
The author highlights descriptions where the patient sees a carrot and draws it perfectly, but when you ask them what it is, they might say, "That looks like some sort of brush," or they describe a cigarette lighter as an instrument for making a small flame.
They can see its shape, its texture, its size, but they can't apply the concept lighter or carrot.
Yes. H.L. Tuber called this a normal percept that has somehow been stripped of its meaning.
That is profound. It demonstrates that the subject has a fully formed, spatial, world-directed perception, but the cognitive act of classification, the application of the concept, is entirely absent.
Perception is clearly occurring without conceptual recognition.
And the second counterexample is even more basic, the problem of animals and infants.
Right. If perception requires the exercise of concepts, then non-linguistic creatures cannot experience the world in a strict sense.
And that, as the source states, is as clear as daylight false.
I think we can all agree on that.
Dogs clearly perceive the environment. Infants certainly perceive their mother's face.
High conceptualists are forced into these really uncomfortable evasions here. They might say animals only possess perceptual sensitivity that doesn't amount to awareness of objective reality, or that their thinking is a rudimentary conceptual analog.
But the author argues this is all just fundamentally backwards.
It's backwards. The foundational awareness sentience is what we share with animals and babies, and that sentience is what grounds our ability to perceive physical objects at all. The conceptual apparatus is merely an add-on. It's irrelevant to perception as such.
So we need to find what does provide world-directedness, the non-conceptual intentionality that is internal to the senses. And this leads us to the author's positive theory, the three equiprimordial sources of intentionality.
Yes, and these three sources, they function prior to any thought or judgment, giving sensory experience its phenomenal link to the mind-independent world.
Okay, let's start with the first one. Phenomenal three-dimensionality.
This is maybe the most obvious, but also the most overlooked. It is the immediate experience of objects being phenomenologically out there.
Spatially separate from me, the subject, and situated in an objective space.
Yes. It is what distinguishes perception, sight, hearing, touch from a mere internal sensation, like a stomach cramp or a buzzing in the ear.
The stomach cramp is located in me, but the mug is located out there.
Precisely. The source argues that this 3D spatial presentation is sufficient for perceptual consciousness and is already world-directed. And they use this compelling example of vestigial sight in severely impaired cataract patients.
Okay, was that?
These patients can barely see objects at all, but they still perceive objective light and shadow. And that light and shadow is public, it's physical, and it's objectively spatial. It's not an internal light show in their head.
So even that minimal objective spatial structure is already a world-directed perception.
That's the claim. This structure immediately resists being interpreted as a mere internal object.
Okay, what about the second source?
The kinetic structure and self-movement. This mechanism is really the engine room of what we call perceptual constancy.
Constancy.
It arises from the fact that perception is intimately integrated with the movement of our sense organs or the movement of our body relative to the scene.
How does my movement prove the world is independent?
Because the awareness of changing sensations caused by our own movement is only tolerable if the object we are aware of is understood to be independent of that subjective movement.
I'm not sure I follow.
Okay, so perceptual constancy refers to situations where an unchanging feature of an object gives rise to wildly changing sensations, but the perceived feature of the object appears unchanged.
Give us the classic example of size constancy again.
Okay. If you move your eye closer to this microphone right now, the retinal image, the raw sensation, it changes dramatically. It enlarges very rapidly.
Right.
Yet the microphone does not look larger.
No, it doesn't.
If the microphone did look larger, that would signal that the changing sensation was about a changing internal object, a sense-datum. The stability of the perceived object, despite the variability of the subjective sensation, confirms the object's independence from the movement of my eye.
Stability of the perceived world in the face of our wobbly moving bodies is one of the strongest internal proofs of direct realism, and it functions entirely outside of thought or judgment.
Your body proves the object is stable.
And this mechanism must be incredibly pervasive.
Oh, it is. Think of shape constancy. If I hold up a round dinner plate and I tilt it obliquely towards you, the image cast on your retina is an oval. The sensation is of an oval shape.
But I perceive the plate as still being round.
Yes. The experience itself compensates for the obliquity, reinforcing the idea that the object's real shape is independent of my specific perspective. This is a fundamental, non-conceptual, intentional structure.
That brings us to the final third source, the Anstoss.
The Anstoss, which literally means shock or resistance, is the central phenomenon in haptic perception, so active touch.
Okay. This source establishes objectivity through the dynamic, effortful encounter with the resistant body. The sense of effort against an alien force establishes a phenomenal space where foreign bodies and our own active body are first located.
And the key is the active-passive difference. How do we know the resistance is objective, rather than just a subjective feeling of our own muscles contracting?
The author details a crucial experiment here. When we push on a table, the resistance we feel is the immediate product of the dynamic interplay of force against force, our muscular effort against the alien force of the table.
Okay.
The proof of the table's independence comes from experiments or thought experiments involving muscle weakening. For instance, through a partial Curer injection.
Curer, the poison that causes paralysis.
A very weak partial dose. So if my muscles are weakened but the table remains the same, what happens?
I would guess it feels harder to push.
Exactly. When the muscles are weakened, a given external resistance, the fixed table, feels much greater because your subjective sense of effort required to maintain the pressure is radically magnified.
Right. Now, if perception were mediated by a sense-datum, we would have to conclude that the sense-datum of the table had suddenly increased in hardness or resistant force. But that is absurd.
Ah, I see. The varying appearance is accounted for entirely by our variable sense of effort, not a changing object of awareness. The external force remains the same.
Precisely. The variability is accounted for by the subjectivity of the effort, which is a property of the subject, not the objectivity of a sense-datum, which is a proxy object. The experience of effort against resistance grounds the distinction between self and world in a fundamental non-conceptual way.
And that successfully blocks the argument from illusion by denying the necessity of sense data in the face of variable subjective experience.
That's the claim.
So what does this all mean?
Yeah.
We've successfully used this adverbial view to manage the illusion of quality, showing that the bentness or the yellowness is an intrinsic modification of the experience, not a separate object.
Right.
And we've grounded the world directedness in three non-conceptual structures: the 3D space, the kinetic constancy, and the Anstoss, the resistance.
Huh?
Now we face the final boss, the argument from hallucination.
Mm.
This is the existence problem. If I experience a fully detailed, pink, elephant-shaped object right here, and no physical object exists, what am I aware of?
The argument from hallucination uses the exact same indiscernibility pattern. P1 and P2 establish that genuine perception and hallucination can be subjectively identical.
They can feel the same.
Right. And since no physical object exists in the hallucinatory state, the subject must be aware of something that is non-physical sense data. And then P3 extends that conclusion to all genuine perception.
So the indirect realist says you're just aware of the sense-datum, which always exists, whether the physical object is there or not.
That's their move.
And the direct realist has to explain the subjective experience without invoking an existing internal object. This is where intentionalism becomes the savior.
The author's solution is a robust defense of intentionalism. The denial that is aware of requires two existing entities. In hallucination, we are aware of non-entities.
Non-entities, objects that do not exist. So I am aware of the pink elephant, but the pink elephant itself does not exist. The awareness is real, but the object of the awareness is non-existent.
Correct. The experience itself, the psychological state of intending, exists and is real. But the object of that intention, the intended thing, the pink elephant, does not.
And this avoids making any awkward ontological commitment to a pink elephant existing in some private mental theater.
It does. Talking about the non-existent object is simply a way of precisely characterizing the content and the specific directionality of the real psychological experience.
This sounds elegant, but surely there are competing views on what a hallucinator is aware of.
There are, and the author strengthens the intentionalist position by critiquing two major opposing views that adhere to what's called the ontological assumption, the belief that genuine awareness can only be directed toward what exists.
Okay, so the first critique targets the nothing there view. This is associated with disjunctivism, or thinkers like Gareth Evans, who claim that a hallucinator is simply aware of nothing at all.
This view is rejected as fundamentally absurd because it cannot coherently account for basic bodily sensations.
How so?
Bodily sensations like pain or a headache are certainly objects of awareness. We are intensely aware of our pain. Yet pain is not an ontologically distinct entity separate from the experiencing subject, nor is it a physical object external to the subject.
That's a very clever move.
Yeah.
So if the expression "is aware of" requires a distinct, existent external object, then we would have to say we are aware of nothing when we feel pain.
Which contradicts our immediate overwhelming experience.
Right.
Since we are overwhelmingly certain that pains are objects of awareness, the claim that a hallucinator is aware of nothing must be false. The feeling of the headache validates the possibility of awareness of something that isn't a separate external physical entity.
Okay, what about the other major attempt to avoid non-entities? The attempt to use logic to explain away the non-existent object.
That targets the traditional attempt to reconstruct negative existential judgments, like Macbeth's dagger does not exist, along Russellian lines.
Bertrand Russell.
Yes, Russell suggested that statements about non-existent objects are actually covert statements about attributes or propositional functions.
So denying the existence of Macbeth's dagger means translating it into something like, it is not the case that there is an entity possessing the attributes of a dagger located in this spot.
And this fails, and it fails catastrophically when applied to perception. Hallucination is not a general propositional statement. It is a de state.
De, meaning about the thing.
About this specific individual object that is bodily present to the subject's senses. The hallucinator is not denying the general existence of daggers. They are denying the existence of this particular object that is phenomenally present before them, occupying a specific space with a specific color and size.
The bodily presence wrecks the Russellian approach because the subject's experience is not one of denial about a concept, but denial about an individually presented entity.
Precisely. The fact that the object possesses bodily presence in the phenomenal field, it is right here, demands an individual specific object reference. The intentionalist theory accommodates this perfectly.
How?
The content of awareness, the specific dagger, is determined by how things sensorily seem. But in hallucination, the object of that content is simply a non-entity.
And the final conclusion is elegant. The intentionalist theory saves direct realism. The hallucination differs from genuine perception only because the more Reality itself, the connection to the mind-independent world, is absent.
Yes. When we perceive veridically or illusorily, we are aware of a real, mind-independent object that figures in the perception. When we hallucinate, the object we are aware of is a non-entity. The difference is the ontological status of the object, not the mechanism or the nature of awareness itself.
A veil of perception is lifted.
That's the argument.
This has been an incredibly rigorous journey into the architecture of conscious experience. To recap the core elements that save direct realism for us, we accepted the challenge of subjective variability, but we rejected the need for sense data by making sensory qualities intrinsic modifications of consciousness.
The adverbial view.
The adverbial view. And having established that the act of perception itself is what carries the sensory character, we then grounded the positive, objective connection to the world in 3 non-conceptual structures that operate prior to language and thought.
The phenomenal three-dimensionality, that spatial separation.
Right.
The kinetic structure, the invariance despite our movement, which proves independence.
And the Anstoss.
The active resistance, which proves foreign force.
Then finally, we handled the existence problem raised by hallucination by deploying intentionalism, accepting that awareness can be directed at non-entities. This means the sensory content is real, but the object of that awareness is non-existent when you're hallucinating. And that ontological difference is the only difference between hallucination and reality.
The author's successful defense of direct realism, however, forces that profound traditional distinction that you raised earlier.
Primary versus secondary qualities.
Yes. Because we use the presence of sensory qualities in illusion to argue that they are inherent to experience, that they're a psychological item, it follows that the purely physical, brute reality must be devoid of sensuous character.
So the physical object is, in itself, not red or warm, but merely disposed to cause the subjective experience of redness or warmth in us.
That is the consequence.
So I think the key takeaway is that the phenomenal independence of the object from the subject, the true cornerstone of direct realism, is found right there, internally proven by the consistency of the world against our subjective movement, constancy, and the non-negotiable resistance of effort, the Anstoss.
This independence is grounded in sensation, not in thought.
Here's where it gets really interesting, building on that intentionalist solution. Since the intentional object of a perfect hallucination like Macbeth's dagger is argued to be a non-entity, it is often seen as a necessary non-existent object.
Meaning it could not possibly have existed as a real thing.
Right, because that would dissolve the distinction between the real and the imagined. So if that metaphysical impossibility holds true for a hallucination, what does it mean for our everyday imagination? If I sit here and vividly imagine a purple unicorn with 6 legs, is that imagined object, which is sensorily coherent and directed at a non-entity, is it metaphysically impossible in the same way?
Yeah.
Does the structure of intentionality itself place metaphysical constraints on what we can successfully imagine? Something for you to mull over as you perceive the world directly once again.
Great question to end on.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the coherence of reality. We hope this has equipped you not just with knowledge, but with an appreciation for the rigor required to defend even our most basic assumptions. We'll see you next time.